Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Star Trek The Next Generation Season 7 review. In this video, I will be covering every episode of Season 7 of Star Trek The Next Generation, the final in my series where I cover every episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, one season at a time. In this video, I will be covering the final season of The Next Generation Season 7. So, I may have mentioned on my channel, once or twice before, that I have a very different view on Season 7 than most other people tend to. Now, the common consensus is that Season 7 is not a very good season. That is very tired. I think most people would agree that it's the third worst behind the first two seasons. In fact, I think some people even go as far to say it's just as bad or even worse than the first two seasons. But the general consensus seems to be, out of the 5 seasons, 3 through 7, 7 is the weakest. And I very strongly disagree with that. In fact, Season 7 is kind of one of my favorite seasons. In fact, I would probably put this as my third favorite season, the third best rather than the third worst. For me, it would be behind seasons 3 and 6 than season 7, which actually, because when I reviewed season 4, I talked about how I wasn't sure which one I'd like better, season 4 or 7, by memory. I both thought they were good, but after rewatching 4 and then rewatching 7, I'm pretty confident I can say I actually prefer season 7. Not by like a lot, maybe just by a little bit, but still, yeah. I think this is the third best season of The Next Generation. Now, a lot of people, when arguing with me, they will always cite, oh, well, even the writers themselves said they were running out of ideas. So, I mean, I'm sure that's true. I'm sure they were thinking, oh, we are running out of ideas, so let's end the show now. Doesn't mean that every episode in the season sucked. Doesn't mean that the season sucked overall. I think there are a few episodes where it is kind of clear that they're kind of running out of ideas. But to be fair, I think there are episodes like that in season 6 as well. Yeah. So, I don't really see that as, oh, this is the hard evidence that season 7 is bad. Because rewatching this season, it's even better than I remember. It seemed there was like good episode after good episode. I mean, there was, some mediocre and crappy episodes in the bunch, mixed in here and there. But for the most part, I was really enjoying the season. I think there's a lot of quality episodes. And this season has a similar feel of season 6, where it's got sort of a darker tone. In some cases, even more so. So it kind of frees it up a bit to do some different things that the show has never done before. So I don't entirely agree with, oh, they were just running out of ideas and repeating themselves, because I think there's a lot of great uniqueness that come out of this season that stands out. Now, this season also was like the family season for some reason. Like, they all of a sudden decided to focus on everyone's relatives. They focused on Geordi's mother, Worf's foster brother, Data's mother, Troy's mother made a return, and you had Picard found out he had a son, and Beverly's grandmother. Leave her alone! But anyway, so yeah, that was a bit weird, and I wouldn't say that I was like a huge fan of that, but I also wouldn't say, oh my god, this is a sign that the season sucks, that we're just bringing in all the family members. I don't care. I mean, I don't think it enhanced the season, but I don't think it damaged it either. I think this is actually, there's a lot of great episodes that I think are really high quality in this season. Anyway, some bad ones too. So let's jump into it. Let's start with the beginning of the season, which did not start very well, I will admit. It had a bit of a weak start. Starting with Descent Part 2. Now, as I mentioned in my Part 1, or my review of Season 6 when I talked about Part 1, Part 2 sucked. It kind of sucked a little bit. It kind of like ruined everything. Like, Part 1 wasn't the best, but it was a pretty intense setup. I remember like being so excited and so like, holy shit, the Borg, and there's lore controlling the Borg, and they have emotions. They got this weird ship, and they're coming for the Federation. Like, it ended on a cliffhanger where Lore is saying, "Together we will destroy the Federation." I was like, holy shit, what kind of intense, huge, suspenseful life and death battle are we gonna have in Part 2? And the answer is none. Instead of going to destroy the Federation, they just hang out on the planet doing experiments and on Geordi, and fucking Dr. Crusher runs off with the Enterprise and destroys the huge Borg ship just by herself by using the sun. And fucking who knows what the hell Riker's doing. Oh, he sees Hugh, but he's being an asshole, and he doesn't even get to hang out with Geordi. And Lore's being a dickhead. He's like, "Oh, look at this visor, isn't it cool?" And he's like, and Data's, of course, completely out of character, and I don't buy just because Lore's feeding him this shit that he would be turn evil. So, yeah, it's a huge letdown. I don't think I did kind of like some of the Dr. Crusher stuff. If I will admit, it was cool seeing her in command, and I liked the ensign and lieutenant, the sort of dynamic they had between them. Well, I got it. Just better. I'm just gonna make sure my calculations are correct, ensign. Like, that was kind of cool. But other than that, like, this episode sucked. I mean, it was a huge failure. Like, there was this huge setup but for like this huge, like, daunting, like, Borg attacking the Federation, but didn't do any of that. And of course, this episode's never mentioned again. So whatever, sucked. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Liaisons. And this episode is silly. Not in a good way either. Like, it's just silly. Like, I guess when people say, oh, they were tired and running out of ideas, I think of episodes like this one where, okay, it does seem that way because, what is the point? Why? What's the point of this episode? Why did they say, oh, let's write this cool episode about these ambassadors who don't really have emotions, so they each coming study emotions? Like, so we had this one dude who's just went to study pleasure, but he just eats all the time. He doesn't get a holodeck. He doesn't do, like, drugs, or he doesn't, like, do any of these other things, like skiing in the holodeck, or like, maybe flying shuttlecraft, stuff that's fun. Instead, he just eats the whole time. It doesn't seem like he's there, or he doesn't have sex for that matter. It doesn't seem like he's there for pleasure. It seems like he's just there to eat. They should call him the gluttonous dude. And and then you have the dude who's there to antagonize Worf, and he doesn't know what anger is, and yet he knows exactly how to piss Worf off and exactly how to be a dickhead. Which is such a cliche, cheesy plot where Worf has been looking after the ambassador, and he, he's like the guy who's being a dickhead to him, and Worf is trying to be nice, but really he wanted Worf to attack him. But yeah, that's just so cliche, so cliche and cheesy. Sorry, cliche, that's my new word, cliche and cheesy. And fuck. There was one good line though out of that storyline. Was when Data, when Worf went to Data and was like about the ambassador, and Data was like, you should try to find something in common. Worf was like, well, he's rude, he's inconsiderate, he's blunt, and Data's like, well, you share all those qualities in abundance. You should have a lot in common. And Worf like snaps at the That was funny, I must admit. But other than that, like, that's dumb. But of course, let's get into the A plot. With another ambassador, this is the most far-fetched of them all. This other ambassador is sent to study love, so he recreates this incident of these logs that they found where this woman crashed on the planet and fell in love with another guy who crashed on the planet. So he was trying to recreate that, so he uses these holograms to pretend to be the woman. But from our perspective, of course, we don't know this, and from Picard's perspective, she just seems like an unhinged crazy woman because this guy doesn't understand emotions. Now, this part of it, I think I like that concept that someone who was like, who doesn't understand emotions and is trying to like force love or make this happen would come off to people who do feel emotions as manipulative and crazy and sort of obsessive. So that part of it I do find kind of interesting. But, you know, this episode tries to play it off a bit like Misery a bit, although she doesn't actively attack Picard, but it has that same sort of vibe to it. But then you find out it's just some dude. Now, I will say, and I didn't think about this in these terms until I just watched this episode, this is actually, I do like how this episode sort of shows that that the woman that kissed Picard and was hitting on Picard turns out to be a man, and the show doesn't bat an eye at it. Picard doesn't bat an eye at it. He doesn't pull an Ace Ventura and be like, he's a man! Which is a really extremely sort of, as I talked about in Ace Ventura, that's very disrespectful towards the transgender community. So this was actually respectful in those terms, where the guy was being a woman and Picard didn't give a shit. And so that aspect, I didn't think about it in those terms before, so that aspect was actually kind of interesting, especially this is like 93 or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I feel like people watching the show in the 90s, this episode in the 90s, would expect that reaction because it was common in cinema, and I think it actually makes a statement by not acknowledging it, by being nonchalant about it. Like, oh yeah, it's a guy, so what? He doesn't really care about the gender, he just cares about the fact that the dude was like lying to him and trying to force him to have love, and Picard was just like, you know, what you just did, that would be considered a crime in our culture. And he's like, crime? What is this? And I don't believe that. I mean, who are these fucking aliens that they don't even know what a crime is? I don't know. I just think the whole concept of this episode is like too far-fetched, and again, it's like, I don't see the point. Anywho, let me get into the next episode, which is Interface. And I don't know, I don't have very fond memories of this episode. I remember it being bad, but watching it again, it wasn't bad per se. It's just kind of like there. It exists. That's what I'll say about this episode. Like, it doesn't like actively annoy me. It's not like terrible or anything, but it's like not interesting or good for that matter. I don't know. It's just, it seems, I think if I try to boil down the problem or my detachment to this episode, is how this is the first time they ever mentioned Geordi's mother, and they instantly make her a main plot point. And yet she's actually not in this episode. It's some alien pretending to be her. So I feel like that relies on us, the audience, like having a familiarity with Geordi's mother, which I suppose we do to an extent through Geordi, just because it's Geordi's mother and we know Geordi. But I feel like it's not as effective in drawing us in or getting us to care about it, because Geordi's mother was barely mentioned before this episode. And the fact that, I mean, it's kind of an interesting concept that Geordi's connected to this probe and these aliens sense him and they try to pretend to be his mother in order to get Geordi to help. But, yeah, I don't know. It's just the way it was executed. I didn't feel what this episode was trying to get me to feel. So it exists. That's what I'll say about that. Alright, so let's move on to the next episode, which is Gambit. And for that, I shall say, here I go again on my own. Going down the only road I've ever known. Here's where I was born to walk alone. The dude looks like he's in an 80s hairband. Don't tell me he doesn't look like he's in an 80s hairband. I'm sorry. The whole time I was just thinking, or either that or I want to rock. I want to rock. I can't look at this guy without hearing all these 80s hairband songs. Anyway, sorry, let me get into this episode proper. So, as far as the episode is concerned, I don't know. It's decent. Like, I think it's a good episode. Like, if you ask me, is this a good episode or a bad episode? I'd be like, well, it's a good episode. It's interesting. I think what I like the most, especially in part 2, because, by the way, I'm talking about both parts at once, because that's what I do. But part 2 particularly was interesting with Data commanding the Enterprise, which is something I desperately wanted to see throughout the entire show's run, and it took 7 seasons. Now, granted, like he would be in command of certain shifts, like they would be in command certain seas, like in The Hunted, he was commanding the Enterprise when hunting that dude, and like he was commanded his own ship in the Redemption Part 2, but it's not the same thing. Just seeing him in the one shift or one scene or in a different ship, I wanted to see him like full on take command of the Enterprise, because Scotty did it like all the fucking time. You always saw Scotty in command of the Enterprise, but you never see Data, or hardly ever. So I love seeing Data in command. I love his sort of interactions with Worf and how he like set him aside as like, stop being a dick, and set it his Data way. And I think he was a really good. It was interesting to see how he'd sit there and do it like that. Of course, he's kind of emulating Picard's command style, and he was actually a good commander, and so that's probably my favorite part of the episode, if I'm being honest, seeing Data in command. Now, as far as the here I go again, as far as the plot with Picard and Riker on the mercenary ship, there's a cheesy quality to this, like just the way that they talk. It's not how like actual criminals would talk. It seems like it was written by novices that don't really know how that kind of thing actually works, and they're kind of basing it off of like old TV shows or old movies. And so like particularly like the scenes where the dude, the here I go again, like the 80s hairy band dude, was trying to recruit Riker, and Riker's like, I think I need a job. Do you know of any? Like, it's something about that whole conversation felt incredibly fake. Like, that's not, and I don't mean fake in the terms that Riker's pretending to be something he's not. I mean fake in that even if he was pretending, even if he was undercover in espionage, like, and if he talked like that, they would be like, people don't talk like that. You're fucking Starfleet. Boom, dead. Like, and Picard as well. Like, some of the way he talked, like, oh, Baran doesn't like it. And the whole thing, like, it's just so convenient that Picard happened to be on that ship, and he happened to have a bad relationship with hairband dude, and and that he happened to put Riker in a position to be friends with hairband dude, and there happened to be that Romulan shit. It's just like, I don't know. It was a bit too convoluted to me, that aspect of it, and the whole, you know, it's Next Generation at this stage is like trying really hard to link in Picard's interest in archaeology into the show, and the whole concept of these raiders going around stealing artifacts because there's like Indiana Jones like magical Vulcan thing that can instantly kill people. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I didn't hate it, but wasn't a huge fan. So this episode's fine, I guess. I mean, mainly like for the data stuff. Okay, so you may have noticed my clothes have changed, my appearance has changed. That's because I recorded my review for Season 7. I looked back, was editing it, and I found out I did not talk about Phantasms, which is in fact the next episode, which I assure you, it was just an error. It was not intentional at all, because I actually love this episode. I think more so than most people, in fact. I think it's an underrated episode. Although, when I did my personal review for this episode, it won the poll. It was highly requested, and I had a lot of people agreeing with what I said about it in my full-length review. But it doesn't seem to be as celebrated as I personally celebrated, because I think the particular blend of eeriness and weirdness was really done successfully. I think this was a huge success because the concept of data dreaming, of course, was introduced back in Season 6. And I think this takes full advantage of that concept. It was an interesting concept, but it wasn't really explored in that episode. And this episode does it to, like, great effect, because it's one of the best use of, like, dreaming I've ever seen in any television or movie ever. Because most... Even that includes like Inception, because as much as I love that movie, don't get me wrong, that movie is way better in this episode, but it's not particularly an accurate depiction of what dreaming is actually like. How convoluted and twisted and just disorientated and that dreaming actually is. But the thing, because dreaming doesn't really have a narrative the way it's portrayed in most TV in movies, but in this episode it doesn't have a narrative either. It's more, but it does have sort of some metaphorical messages that you can interpret in different ways, and that is definitely true of many dreams. Those who examine their own dreams or who've studied this will know that there are sort of takeaways, that there are some sort of metaphors that are trying to, your subconscious trying to tell you something. So I love that they made an episode with Data where his subconscious is trying to tell him something. Now, I don't know exactly how that works, that Data actually has a subconscious. I mean, but I guess if he has the ability to dream, it does sort of imply that he has a subconscious. Maybe there's part of his programming that recognizes these alien parasites, but it's not like the main part that's connected to his cognitive thinking, but it was some part of him, so his like dreaming program picked up on it. And it's a little bit far-fetched, but I think its execution is like so good. I think it captures that eeriness of dreaming, and plus, like, the way the episode unfolds, where they don't really explain the parasites until, like, towards the end of the episode, I think was amazing. So at first, you don't know what's going on. It puts you into Data's shoes, where you just think he's going insane, or he's malfunctioning, or there's something wrong with him. And I think the reveal that there's actually these parasites, and plus, once they revealed that there's these parasites that are, like, eating them alive, and the whole crew would like be disintegrated in a matter of a week, that was fucking eerie as hell. That was scary. This is something I think actually Season 7 effectively does horror and suspense like better than I would say almost any other season of Star Trek. And so I felt the tension level, like the stakes were actually really high, and I felt really engaged and invested in that. Like whenever I see those scenes with those parasitic creatures, and they show them like they have the scanner, and they show like Riker's face like infested with this, like that creeps me the fuck out. And I think it's extremely effective horror. And I think the solution where they have to go inside Data's dreams and deal with all these weird imagery and try to interpret it to find out the solution was really effective. So I love this episode. I think it's a great episode, one of the better episodes of Next Generation, and particularly of Season 7. It's one of my points of contention to people who don't like Season 7, because I think this episode's great. But anyway, just me. Anywho, Let's get into the next episode, which is Dark Page. And I think I mentioned this episode before in previous reviews in terms that it's one of the better Loaxana Troy episodes. I would call it the second best behind Half a Life. Her Next Generation episodes is way better than her Deep Space Nine appearances, they all suck. I have to throw that in there every time. I'm sorry, but I do. And this is an example of that, though, because this is actually a pretty decent episode. Now, it is a pretty strong retcon, though, that Troy just happens to have a long-lost sister that I kind of don't buy that Loaxana would like hide it from her the whole time and suppress a memory of an entire person in a home, or like none of this ever came out. Like, that's a bit hard to buy, but I think the plot with the aliens that communicate through telepathy, and I love how every time they communicate through telepathy, they have the actors like stare really hard at them. And then they have that noise, the sound effect. Look, it's telepathy because he's staring and there's noise coming through. But anyway, I like the concept of those dudes. They had, Kirsten Dunst play the little girl. Didn't know that at the time. But then when Troy actually went inside her head, like, it's like extreme measures from Deep Space Nine and stuff like that. When they do the inside the head stuff, like someone goes inside someone else's head, I think there's one or two examples where that works. Like Frame of Mind, that wasn't really Riker going inside someone's head; he was inside his own head, so that worked a lot. But this, I don't know, episodes when people go into other people's heads, I don't know, it doesn't really work. It comes off as a bit cheesy, like having that wolf. Oh, I gotta talk about the scene with the wolf. I was laughing in that scene because it is so obvious that was the friendliest dog you could come by. It is so obvious that dog is like, as soon as the yell cut, the dog would like wag its tail and go up and like want to treat and like hug people. But they added in like these sound effects of wolves growling. And so I guess it would probably like trick the senses for most people because they would hear that sound effect and like, oh, it's a vicious dog. But if you look at the visual, if you look at it, you can tell that sound effect is very clearly added in post, and that dog is extremely friendly. And it didn't look vicious or threatening at all. They just have the sound effect to make you think that. But anyway. But this episode is decent. I do like this episode. So let me get into the next episode, which is Attached. Now, I think the plot is kind of contrived and just exists to have a relationship episode with Picard and Beverly, which is, I think, the worst thing I have against it. Now, the plot's not terrible. It's not the worst thing ever. It's not entirely interesting how there's, the world that's split in half and only half wants to join the Federation while there's this paranoid nation state that's like isolationist, and they kidnap Picard and Riker, but then we turn out that the people who are working with Riker who want to join the Federation are completely paranoid and all the rockers. And I think some of the time when they have like all these weird machines and how they're just like over the top paranoid, like that was a bit too silly for me. I think, that kind of annoyed me. I didn't really like it when the dude was being like over the top paranoid and to the point where he thought that Picard was working with the other side. But it was kind of interesting having that diplomatic issue that Riker had to sort of weave through, and that he eventually found a solution by saying, well, you're worried that these other guys are going to join the Federation, so let me assure you that ain't going to happen. So that scene was kind of cool. But what I do like about this episode is the Beverly and Picard stuff. This, I think, was long overdue. They hinted at it a lot in season 1 and then promptly forgot about it. And, well, you got hints of it every once in a while. Like, Allegiance when Picard and Beverly kissed, although that wasn't the real Picard, that was an imposter. And them having breakfast together all the time, just that close relationship. And I think this was, so I like the character story between the two of them, and I like the way they explore their feelings in this episode. I kind of wish that they actually did, like, especially since in All Good Things they had this feature where they were married and divorced, so why not just put them in a relationship in this episode? So that kind of annoyed me as well. But the plot about them being like telepathically linked through those things like that, I think that was an interesting storyline. I did like that. So this is a decent episode. It was pretty good. So, yeah, let me get into the next episode, which is Forces, or Force of Nature, or Forces of Nature, I'm not sure. I think it's just Force of Nature. I always like this episode. I think, I gotta be honest, a lot of it probably has to do with nostalgia, for this episode in particular. I just always liked the feel of this episode. Like, again, the music again is pretty much the same kind of music they've been playing a lot throughout season 6 and 7, but for me it felt like extremely like powerful in this episode. Like the scene where I thought the scene was like really super intense, where that rift formed and the medical ship was stuck in it, so the Enterprise came up with this plan to like coast and to get the ship. But then the medical ship wasn't aware that warp engines is what causing the rift, so they try to go to warp, and they just, of course, cause the rift to like expand, and that the Enterprise is like screwed. Which I thought that was super intense, actually, and I always remember that music that they play when Data's like, "I'm sorry, we no longer have the force to escape the rift," and they play that. Like, I don't know, I just have really strong memories of being so enthralled and finding that so intense. And plus, I like the characters of course, the analogy is very obvious of environmentalists and people trying to warn of climate change. And it's obvious that they wanted to do a climate change episode. And I like the characters of it does remind me of a lot of people I knew and know who do have like extreme political views and are activists, and how she feels like no one's listening to her, and like the situation is dire, like it's life and death, but no one's really taking her seriously, to the point where she sacrifices her life. I thought that was interesting. And the other guy, of course, was also an activist and also took this issue very seriously, but he wasn't as sort of radical, I suppose the word would be. He was a bit more tempered, and seeing how and that's another really intense scene, is when she blew up her own ship and killed herself, and seeing the reaction of her brother, like, who's devastated by that, and this rift forms, and again they have that music, da, da, which I don't know, I always really like it. Now the first half of this episode is like just like Data and Geordi talking about Spot, so it does make me think that the story wasn't long enough, and so they had to create all this other filler to fill out the runtime, so they had all this stuff about Spot, which, yeah, is okay. But the obvious gripe that most people have with this episode is that, of course, that it leaves a like specific like rule that should be long lasting, that there's a warp speed limit, and it's really shortly forgotten after that. Throughout season 7, you'll hear Picard like, "Oh, we have permission to exceed warp 5," or whatever. But shortly thereafter, season 7, nobody cares about it, and I think rightfully so. And So I do get that argument that they should have done that in the first place, because they were definitely weren't going to stick to it. And it would just hinder them too. I heard like people actually talk about when they created Voyager, which was being created around the same time, that they purposely had the nacelles that could go up and down, that was supposed to have something to do with like they could travel at warp safely without like causing these rifts. But that was the writer's thinking behind it. Nobody cared about this shit. It just wiped it clean. Which, to be fair, I think they should have. But I don't hold it against this episode as much as a lot of people do. A lot of people are like, well, who cares about this episode because they just erased what happened in this episode anyway. Yeah, but there's a lot of great episodes like Mind's Eye and stuff that where Geordie's like, I remember, I'm so traumatized. In the next episode, he's fine. But it's still an amazing episode. So to me, it doesn't really take anything away from this episode that they rightfully retconned it. but I still think it's an interesting episode. But as I said, a lot of that's probably due to nostalgia. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Inheritance. Now, I never cared for this episode. It seemed out of nowhere. And it's something me and my sibling always joked about all the time about how Data has so many goddamn family members. It's just like, it's ridiculous. Like, okay, so he has a father, brother, mother, and then in Nemesis he has another brother, and then Picard now he has an adopted human brother, and it's just like Data is the one who has the biggest extended family in the whole show. And it's just ridiculous. He doesn't need to have a mother. And I remember not buying this at all. It just seemed really like shoehorned in. It's like we explored Data's origins enough. We don't need to shove another like character in another piece. Like every time what's her face was talking about, oh, I remember when Soon created you, you forgot to. I just think like bullshit. It's like, I don't know. It's like we don't need this more information about this. But I will say on my rewatch of this episode this time around, I enjoyed it a lot more because I was able to look past all that, because I accept, okay, they retcon this bullshit with Data's mother. Fine. Move past that. Examine the episode as it is. And it's actually pretty interesting. It is a pretty interesting character story for Data and how he's put with the dilemma. Even though, again, I totally don't buy that she's another android, a super advanced android just meant to look like a human. I was wondering while I was watching this episode, where is this android during Picard times? But then they said at the end that the android is meant to like live a natural human life and die, and so she's probably dead by then, by Picard times. But I don't know, and it's just a bit silly that there was another android out there as well, and it was never really referenced again. It just seems kind of a waste of time. But as an episode for itself, it's actually pretty decent. It is an interesting character story for Data, so there we go. Whatever. Anyway, let me move over to the next episode, which is Parallels, which has always been a favorite of mine. I always love this episode to death. This is pretty much when this episode aired. It was like almost exactly the type of episode I wanted to see. It's like the writers, when I was watching it, it's like, oh my god, they have like some mind device attached to my head and like put on screen exactly what I wanted to see. And it's funny because the reception on this episode, I've heard some people say, oh, it's not very well liked, and some people don't like this episode that much, but I look on IMDb, it was pretty high up, actually, if I remember correctly. It was like in the top 20, so I don't know. I don't know what these people are talking about. It seemed like this episode was pretty well liked. I always well liked it, and everyone I knew did as well. It's an interesting concept and I do find the whole concept of there being like an infinite number of parallel universes for like very minor things, like that's how this episode plays it, like just because the painting is on one side of the room and another, there's a whole another parallel universe for that. That's a concept I never really got on board with, but if I'm going with the premise or whatever, I mean, because maybe there's a lot more different about that parallel universe. Just as far as Worf is concerned, the only thing that's different is the painting. But it could be maybe there's like whole planets and whole species that exist that don't exist in our universe, but it has nothing to do with Worf, so he's not aware of it. That's my rationalization for it. But anyway, so it's an interesting concept where Worf keeps jumping into different parallel universes, and I like the way they played it. I think this is one of the most effective Worf episodes, because it wasn't just, it had nothing to do with his Klingonness. I mean, sure, he went to a Bat'leth tournament, but that wasn't the point of the plot. The point of the plot was the parallel universes. So you think they would choose a sciencey character like Data or Geordi, but I like how they chose Worf, because he's not a sciencey character, and it was interesting the way that they played off of that. So this, one of the few Worf episodes is not about him being a Klingon. And plus, as I said, it's just such a fascinating concept. It's almost exactly the type of thing I wanted to see. And you got to how it was a mystery and you didn't know what was going on. It was just strange. At first there was slight details that were off, like Picard was standing over there and he's standing there, and Cardassians attacked, but they didn't attack before. That was cool. I think it was executed really, really well. But then when they got up to the end, where all the hundreds and hundreds of Enterprises emerging in that one spot, that was fucking amazing. I remember my mind was so blown. I was like, oh my god, it's so awesome. And then they had that one Riker from the Borg universe where it's destroyed, and he had this beard. He's like, the Borg are everywhere. That. This is just a cool episode, man. I don't know why people who in their right mind wouldn't like this episode. This episode's amazing. Absolutely love it. Anyway, Worf and Troy are together in this episode, but I'm actually willing to forgive it and give it a pass because it's a parallel universe. There's parallel universes, who cares? I mean, Intendant was having sex with Cisco in the Mirror Universe all the time. I don't care. It's a parallel universe. I don't care about parallel universes. But when they actually explore Worf and Troy's relationship in this universe, that's when I have an issue, but that will come later. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is the Pegasus. Another really great episode. Don't tell me what I can't do. No, sorry. Every time I see John Locke on there, of course the actor Terry O'Quinn, who plays Eric Pressman, also played John Locke on Lost, which is something I was really obsessed with, and so I recognize him from. Although, of course, I saw this episode first. It came out first, obviously, and so when I saw Lost, I was like, hey, it's Eric Pressman. But then, of course, I got used to Lost, and so then I thought of him as John Locke, and then when I watched this episode again, I was like, hey, it's John Locke. But he's a good actor. He is a great actor, and he does a really good job in the role as the sleazy admiral. I've heard some arguments that he's one of the worst admirals out there. I think that's a valid argument to make. And I think this is a really interesting storyline about Riker's past, because we explored some of his recent past, but we get into more of his when he was a young ensign, when he was young and dumb and just doing whatever people told him to do, and that he's evolved into a different a man. But then Eric Pressman comes back and expects him to act the same. And I love the dynamic between Riker and Picard, how Picard can tell something's up, but the Admiral outranks him, so he can't do anything, but he still dresses down Will, and Will's just like, look, I can't do anything because he's an Admiral. Maybe you should take this up with him. And Picard's like, I'm taking it up with you! Which was such an awesome scene. I think this is a truly powerful episode, but that these are the Voyagers. Scenes from Enterprise clearly do not fit in this. That was so dumb, but I guess I already did my Enterprise review, and I think I did mention that actually, how it doesn't fit into this episode, how that was really contrived, but that's more to do with the Enterprise episode. And plus the Romulans, the way the Romulan is like, I love this Romulan guy. I wish we would have saw more of him because he's like, he's very unique and different than most Romulans. He's the most like outwardly friendly, but it's so obvious that he's like being fake and just deceptive, like underneath it. And I just love the way, oh, I am touched by your concern, but we were never actually in any danger. Like, it's just the way they played it. It was so good. And in fact, when after they like trapped the Enterprise, like they destroyed the entrance of the asteroid to trap the Enterprise in the asteroid, and Picard's like, what do you want? He's like, oh, I'm just here to help. I saw you're in a bit of trouble. I had nothing to do with it, but I could help you out if you want. Like, it was so good. And of course, they make sort of, it reminds me a bit of, in retrospect, it reminds me a bit of the Rogue One, having the whole movie being about like filling in the plot hole about the Death Star being too easy to destroy, where this fills in the plot hole which people have been complaining about before this episode aired. Now, if you're not old enough to remember, you might not be aware, but before this episode aired, people complained so much about why Starfleet doesn't have cloaking technology. Because they're like, what? Klingons are smarter than Starfleet? They can come up with something that Starfleet... They have the smartest engineers, smartest minds. So they saw this huge plot hole that Starfleet didn't have cloaking technology. But then this episode came out and filled in that plot hole. And to say, actually, Starfleet could make cloaking technology. It's not that they're not advanced enough, but it's that they made a treaty with the Romulans that prevents them from doing so. Which I think makes a lot of sense. I think it's a better way to fill the plot hole than Rogue One, if I'm being honest. And then they actually play off of this more in Deep Space Nine when the Defiant has a cloaking device, which they had to loan from a Romulan. You have a Romulan on board being very protective of it. Like, that's very good continuity. So I think it was a very good decision. I think they made an excellent storyline out of it by having, Pressman trying to violate the treaty with this phasing device. And then Riker choosing the right side. Like, that was a powerful moment where he was just like, well, fuck you, as Pressman. I'm going to defy you. Great episode. Absolutely love it. So anyway... Let me get into the next episode, which is Homeward. Another amazing episode. When throughout the show's run, I remember season 1, Worf mentioned that he had a foster brother, and I was like, why don't we ever see him? I actually really, really wanted to see Worf's foster brother because we saw Worf's parents, and then when they had a preview for this episode, they said, "Oh, well, this is Worf's foster brother." I was like, "Yes, we finally get to see him." I guess that was a bit of a nerd pick for me. That was a nitpicky because most people probably didn't even pick up on it because it's just one random line of dialogue back in season 1, Heart of Glory, I think it was. But I was like, yes, we get to see Nikolai, and I like the interactions between Worf and Nikolai. But they make it this is a really interesting concept. I think this is probably my favorite Prime Directive episode. Although, to be fair, Picard is kind of a dick in this, like, so there's been other Prime Directive episodes that I defended Picard, like, particularly Who Watches the Watchers, because I heard other people saying that Picard was being a complete asshole and complete dick about everything. And I didn't agree. But here, I think, like, he is, clearly. Like, he's taking the Prime Directive to an extreme, and when Nikolai has this plan to, like, save some people's lives, he's like outright, oh my god, that defies the very thing of the Prime Directive. And I like how there's certain people in the room like Crusher who actually support this plan, but Worf is just stuck in his head. He doesn't even give a shit about the plan or not. He just cares about the fact that his brother's defying orders and being dishonorable, and so it reflects on him as dishonorable, and so he's taking it personally. I love that dynamic. It's a very interesting dynamic. And of course, it gets even more interesting when Nikolai, of course, defies orders and beams people on board the holodeck, which I just thought that was a fascinating concept that they... see, again, anyone who would say, oh, they're running out of ideas in Season 7, I say, bullshit! This is such a fresh, original idea. I think it is really unique and sticks out in the Star Trek universe of having, trying to save a group of primitive people by having the holodeck like gradually change the scenery until they get to take them to the new planet. And of course, something goes wrong where one dude gets out, and it happens to be the most sort of orthodox religious kind of dude who gets out, the one who would like adjust the least to finding out that this is all fake. He's probably the worst possible guy that could have gotten out, and he gets out, and those scenes were just so damn intense. Like when he's in 10 forward and like cowering and like freaking out and having a panic attack, and Troy's just like, I'm your friend. Like, that was powerful stuff. I think this is from some of the most powerful scenes in the entire show. And of course the fact that presented a dilemma where Nikolai just wanted him to like never come back. It's like Picard's gonna let him back. This is gonna ruin everything. And they're like, well, we're not gonna keep him here against his will. But of course he ends up killing himself, which is very tragic. And just like when the scene when he's talking to Picard, like about his options, Picard's like, well, if you go back, people might think you're just crazy. And he's like, I don't think I could live the rest of my life knowing what I know and that being thought of as a madman. It's such a powerful dilemma. So it's like, ultimately, I think you have to side with Nikolai, because Picard's plan would just let everyone die, which I think is callous, and I think that's bullshit. But it does show that Picard's trepidation is justified because there is side effects to that. And the dude, his life was ruined, and he basically killed himself, was a negative effect of that. But of course, ultimately, I think it's worth it because he would have died anyway if they just left him on the planet. At least now the rest of his village gets to live. Of course, he had a really horrible death, arguably more horrible than it would have been had they just died on the planet with everyone else. But I think it's worth it. So it's that kind of nuanced storytelling that I actually think is really damn good. I don't know why this episode is so underrated. I think this episode's amazing. I think it's one of the best. Alright. Now it's time to get to the episode that I do agree with everyone is absolutely terrible. And that is Sub Rosa. Probably is gonna, pretty much easily the worst episode of the entire show. So, I recently did a review for this episode because I was doing my top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, and this was number 3. Number 3 for the entire Star Trek franchise, worst episode. And it's funny because I watched this episode and I did a review for it right before I started watching Season 7. So when I got to this episode, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to watch it a second time. I had just watched it like a week before. And I was like, there's no way I'm putting myself through this crap to like twice in like a couple weeks. Not doing it. I'm sorry. I like you guys, but not that much. I'm not going to force myself. And I don't need to because it's still fresh in my mind anyway. Dinner light the candle and dinner go to the deuce. It's such a terrible, stupid episode. Of course, as I said, I did a whole review when I went into a lot more detail about just how horrible this episode is and how it's just like a cheesy romance novel, but like much, much worse. And Dr. Crusher, like, is unbelievable. Gates McFadden's acting is absolutely horrendous. In this episode, you got First Minister Shakar playing the Space Ghost that Beverly Crusher is being molested by, and she actually likes being molested by a Space Ghost, and she gets brainwashed like super quickly and then snaps out of it super quickly for no reason. And you got stupid over the top Scottish accent saying don't dinner or go to the house, and it's just terrible. It's a terrible episode. And the ham acting I alluded to earlier, when the Dr. Crusher's grandmother comes out of the coffin and she hasn't decayed at all. Like, how long was she in the coffin for? Quite a bit. And she hasn't decayed in the least, and she's taken over by the the Space Ghost with glowing eyes and like shooting lightning bolts. And Dr. Crusher's like, "You're not Nana! Leave her alone!" I want to get into my worst list, so I don't want to spoil. I'm going to save some of my discussion on why this is the worst episode of the entire Star Trek franchise for that video. But, man, this is a special level of just terrible. Of just absolute cliche, horrible writing. It's just nonsensical and dumb. Enough of that. Let me move over to the next episode. Thank God. Which is Lower Decks. It's funny how that terrible episode is sandwiched in between two great episodes. That's a bit weird. But anyway, Lower Decks, the episode, not the new show. That's just come out on CBS All Access that I've been watching. Although, showrunner for that show did mention being inspired by this episode, which I think is obvious because he stole the name from it. But I think that at first, I gotta be honest, when I first saw this episode, I was thrown off by the concept. I wasn't really used to these. The Next Generation hasn't really done these concept episodes. It's something Voyager would do a lot. They would do a lot of these concept episodes that focus on a different group of people. But I was thrown off by Next Gen doing it. But the more I sit with this episode throughout the years, and the more I watched it, the more I liked it. And to the point now where I do think this episode is a masterpiece. There's shows like Lost that cited that they were inspired by it, and that's why they did Nikki and Paolo, but that failed. And the reason why it failed is because they just threw in these characters out of nowhere and tried to pretend like they were there the whole time. Where this episode, they should have actually studied this episode more, if this was the episode that inspired him, and took a note from him, because this episode had two characters that were seen previously. It had Nurse Ogawa and Ensign Sato. And I love how actually Nurse Ogawa was slowly starting to become a more important character throughout season 6 and 7. And after this episode, she's seen even more, of course. And she was just a background character that first popped up in season 4 and was in and out throughout season 4. And they made her a main character in this episode, and I think that's amazing. In fact, I kind of wish they did that with more characters. There was a character, it was an ensign or lieutenant. There was a Ensign Kellogg, who was a security officer who, during my rewatch, I noticed I saw her a lot. Mostly in season 4, but I think she's in season 5 as well. I'm not sure if she was in 6 or 7 at all. But I wish they had her. And I wish they had all these supporting characters we saw in the background. Maybe have Ensign Rhaegar in there as well. But no, having Ogawa is good enough. And they brought back Ensign Sito from First Duty, who was just one random character. She had like a line or two, but she didn't have much to do. But they kind of followed up on that episode and made it about Picard particularly choosing her because of the incident with the Daredevil stunt, because he didn't think another captain would give her a fair shot. But we see, of course, the whole episode from their perspective. Now, they do introduce two new characters, but I think that's fine because you also have the two characters that are recognizable, and they form their own little group. I think my only gripe about this episode, or my biggest gripe, I should say, is that I feel like they're constantly trying to figure out what's going on. And I think trained officers would know better to do that. Like, if they're not told stuff, wouldn't imagine they'd be gossiping behind the backs of the senior officers and trying to figure out what it is that's the secret. I suppose, but they get to the point in the episode where Ogawa and the other people are like, look, we can't tell you because we're under orders. And the guy kind of takes it a bit hard. But I think, like, that should be trained, and Starfleet officers should be used to that. So, I mean, that's my only really gripe. Also, okay, one other gripe is that they share quarters. I mean, this is a freaking Galaxy-class starship. Guests that come on board have these huge, luxurious rooms, and yet they make ensigns share quarters. I think that's bullshit. I think this ship is huge, big enough as some people call it an apartment complex in the space. There's plenty of room. They have enough for people to have their own rooms. Like, stuff like the Defiant I could buy because that's a short-range warship. Like Enterprise, like from, it's been a long time, that Enterprise. And XM1, like, you totally buy that because that's the first ship ever to go into space. And that space will be limited. And, even Kirk Times, I could buy that a bit but with this Enterprise, like the freaking apartment complex, bullshit. They have enough room. There's no reason why they should share quarters. Don't get me started on the show to Lower Decks has to have all the ensigns sleeping in a hallway. Like, that is stupid, but I'm not here to talk about that show. So that kind of bothered me. But other than that, this episode is amazing. Like, not only does it follow these characters, but it does such a great job of doing it. It really gets you to identify with these characters in such a short time. And in fact, it has a very emotional through story, particularly with Cedo, how she, Worf sort of looks after her and, like, does that whole T-Todd challenge and kicks her ass to try to get her to stand up to Picard. And it leads to her going on this mission where she dies. And it's a very, very effective death. I think it is I must admit to shedding some tears, getting choked up. I think this episode's a masterpiece. Honestly, I think it is amazing. Now, I talked a bit about this in my Deep Space Nine reviews about Hard Time, because the original concept for the episode Hard Time was that Ensign Cedo would come back to life, would come back. And it turned out she wasn't dead, that she was in a Cardassian prison and she was going through PTSD. And I said in that review, and I'll say it again, they really, really should have done that. I really feel they should have done that. I think it would have been way, 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 way better than what they actually did do with Hard Time, which I didn't buy because O'Brien was fine the next episode, so who cares? The whole point is PTSD is everlasting, so it's undercut its own point by making it disappear in the next episode. But they could have kept the PTSD. They could have done the story with PTSD being everlasting with a side character like Cedo who barely appears, because they could show her again and show that she still has PTSD. Now, I have heard the opinion that it would have undercut this episode by revealing that she was still alive, because this episode is so powerful that she dies at the end, but I actually disagree with that. I actually think even if it was revealed she was still alive, I don't think that undercuts any emotional impact of this episode. Just like, for example, Star Trek II Wrath of Khan, when Spock dies, still emotional as shit, even though he comes back to life in the next movie. Still a very emotional scene. And so I think this is the same thing here, even if you find out, I'm not dead, even if she's not really dead, it doesn't change how impactful, because her friends think she's dead and how it affects them in that scene where Ben, the bartender dude, like takes the chair and moves it. It's like, oh, Worf, you can go sit over, and makes Worf sit over. Like, that was such a powerful scene. Such a great scene. So this is an amazing episode. Absolutely. Alright, let me get to the next episode, which is Thine Own Self. This episode was I didn't really think that much of it when it first aired. But it's funny, like, throughout the years, like, the more I sat with this episode, the more I saw it, like, I grew to love this episode. Now, I wouldn't say this is, like, top tier best of the best kind of episode, but I still really like it. I still think it is a really powerful episode. Mainly the Data storyline. Troy's storyline, it was somewhat interesting. I like the resolution where she has to order, like, Geordi to his death in order to pass the test. Like, that was interesting, but overall, like, I didn't really care about the storyline. It was mainly the Data storyline, which I actually think, to me, like, I compare it to, like, Hero Worship, which is another example of Data, like, hanging out with a kid. And I thought that episode was just boring as fuck. Like, I had no emotional connection to Data having this relationship with the kid, but in this episode, I completely did. Now, I've heard complaints, particularly from my sister, about how the whole amnesia storyline is very cliche. I guess I hadn't encountered it as much as she had, so I didn't complain about it as much as she did. But so it didn't bother me. It didn't bother me that they were using the amnesias, even though, I mean, it is kind of a trope. I think what they did with it, with having, like, because the relationship Data has with the young girl and her father was so good. It was so well done. It's something, I think that really worked. And there's other examples where they tried to team Data up with a kid, like in Insurrection, and it just failed. I mean, this is the only time I think they actually got it right, where I actually cared about a Data and his relationship with this young girl and how she really cared about him. And it was a really interesting adventure, and I like how, like, the solution's kind of simple for us, because we know that the thing says radioactive, and he's taking all these radioactive probe fragments and just handing them out to people. So obviously that's why they're sick, but from their perspective, they don't know, and they had no idea. And seeing Data, like, piece this together was really interesting. And plus, like, as I said, like, as far as this little girl is concerned, Data died. Like, he was murdered, saving everyone's lives. And then Riker and Crusher just beam Data up without anyone's knowledge. And he's actually still alive, but no one else knows it. And so I thought the whole thing was actually quite powerful. If I'm being honest. Particularly like that scene where the young girl is like, oh, do you really think there's a place where everyone can be happy and work together in peace? And Data looks up at the stars and says, I do. And it's like, you could imagine, like, there was part of him, even though he had the amnesia, that knew about, like, the Enterprise. And then how they looked up at the stars. I think I remember shedding a tear during that scene. Like, I think I like this episode. I know it might not be popular to say that, but I do. I think it's really good. Anyway, let me get to the next episode. Oh, talking about unpopular opinions. Here's a doozy. Let's get into the next episode, which is Masks. And here's what you're expecting me to say. Oh, I hate this episode. This episode sucks. It's so cheesy and stupid. Yeah, I actually like this episode. This is going to be a move along home situation where everyone's going to be like, what? You like this episode? What? But, I don't love it. To be honest, I used to. When this episode first came out, I loved it. I would put it in my top 10s. Well, maybe not top 10s. Top 20s. Top 30s. Not top 10. But I used to love this episode. Years has tempered me a bit, and I don't love it anymore. But I still kind of like it. I still think it's an interesting concept. Again, this is this show, like, really trying hard to push Picard's interest of archaeology into the main plot. But I think it's an interesting plot where there's a comet, but it turns out there's actually this really ancient like computer that has like all this, stuff about ancient cultures, and it turns Enterprise into like a museum, and it's like matter transferring, and they have to sort of study the mythology and learn about it, and of course Picard uses his knowledge, his archaeology knowledge, because they have to do it that way, of other cultures to sort of reason what's going on. And I think what I like most about this episode is the whole Data, how he starts to lose his mind. And I love that scene in particular where he says, what does it feel like when one is losing one's mind? And Geordi's like, you're scaring me, Data. Like, that was a really powerful scene. Now, I know why everyone hates this episode, because of Brent Spiner's over-the-top ham acting, but I honestly, I never was bothered by it. I mean, sure, it is ham acting. That's a bit over the top, but it made so much sense for the story that they were telling. I was able to look past it. I know a lot of people think it's over the top of the way he goes, go away, and stuff like that, but I think it made sense for the story, and I think the story is well constructed. Whatever. Attack me, at me, I don't care. That's what I felt. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Eye of the Beholder. And this is an episode I don't like, because it's Worf and Troy. And I think the whole concept of the empathic echo, where, so the whole thing about someone commits suicide and they try to figure out why, but they find out it's this empathic episode, thing for this murderer, the dude who was in Aliens. I don't know, what else was this dude in? Shawshank Redemption, a few other things. It's a character actor. But anyway, as soon as I saw him, like, that's the bad guy, because he always plays a bad guy. Yeah, I mean, what is there to say about this episode? It's not very good. And the whole Worf-Troy relationship, I really didn't buy. Like, really didn't buy. They had zero chemistry. It's just like, stop it. So, no, not a good episode. Anyway, let's move over to the next episode, which is Genesis! Genesis! Okay, this is another episode that's straight out, I will admit, point blank nostalgia. I really like this episode for the nostalgia. I remember watching this episode when I got home from a camping trip, and it was like sort of rainy and dark outside, and I put this episode on, and it scared the fuck out of me. It was really creepy. I do think, objectively speaking, that this episode does a good job of creating that really creepy atmosphere, that vibe throughout particularly throughout the first part of the episode, where you see the crew starting to lose their shit when Worf spits the shit on Dr. Crusher, and she freaks out. Like, that was a terrifying scene. And then you have the senior officers meeting. At this point, they're all starting to act all weird. Like, Riker is being really dense and what's going on? And Barclay's talking really fast, and they had hints Orgawa was even acting a bit like a primate. That was a really great lead in to, and then it cuts the commercial, you get back from the commercial, and you follow Data and Picard, and they get back, and everything's fucked. I think that was a really, really effective, way to introduce this horror story. I think they did a really great job of making it really creepy. Even more so than Macrocosm on Voyager, which I pointed out, that episode's really similar to this one in format. And this one came first, and I think it does it better, honestly. But of course, the science behind this episode is nonsense. It's complete nonsense. De-evolving. They turn into frogs and spiders. What the hell? That's all just nonsense. Nonsense. And plus, like, Crusher caused this to happen because she was incompetent. She just gave Barkley too much of this thing, and then she tries to laugh it off like, ha ha ha, I did this by accident. Silly me. All these people were killed and mutilated in the most horrible ways, and we all transformed into weird creatures, but ha 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 ha, silly me. Like, I'm sorry, I don't buy that level of incompetence from Crusher. In a way, they just try to laugh it off like it's no big deal. And of course the fact that it's nonsense. But it's still like having that wharf creature like chase Picard around the ship. That it captures the essence of the creepiness like really, really well. I do think if I ever did a horror episode countdown of the Star Trek franchise, this would actually be quite up there. I think this is one of the more effective ones. Even if the plot is nonsense. Anyway, so I always had a special place in my heart for this one. So anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Journey's End. So this is basically the origin of the Maquis. This is where the Maquis all start, because this is like leading into they had a plan because they're working on Voyager. In fact, they came up with the idea of the Maquis for Voyager, which surprised me when I learned that. I always thought they came up with it in Deep Space Nine, because of that episode 2-parter introduces the Maquis in Deep Space Nine. It does feel like that's what they're for. But apparently they were just creating it for Voyager so they could have Chakotay and all them. And so this sort of is the early seeds where they first introduced the concept of the treaty and how to some planets on one side of the Federation border and the Cardassian border, wherever, the Maquis will come a bit later. And that's all well and good. And the plot about Picard trying to get... being ordered to forcibly remove Native Americans, which has historical implications he's obviously and rightfully very uncomfortable with, was also a very interesting plot. But Wesley Crusher's a dick in this episode, and I don't like it. I don't like Wesley, oh, fuck you, man, oh, extra dick, blah, blah, blah. Shut up. This is the biggest, like, shut up, Wes. I'm sorry. It's almost worse than him being a Mary Sue. Well, okay, maybe not worse, but that was pretty bad, but it's not any better. Like, they go from one extreme to another, being a Mary Sue that saves the universe to being a whiny little brat that does nothing worthwhile. Why do I have to go to the planet? Shut the fuck up, Wesley. God damn it. So, really don't like, and plus, like, the whole thing of having him, like, go off with the Traveler, like, I think that was dumb. I'm sorry, because I think it's obvious. You go back and watch Where No One Was Gone Before, and the Traveler talks about how Wesley's special. They're really doing that to set him up to become like this really important Starfleet officer. I don't know. To me, that's obvious. To me, it's saying that he's going to become an important human being in their species, not that they're going to take him away and he's going to go outside of existence and become a Traveler. I just think that whole thing is dumb, and I would say it was retcon, but not really. He popped up in Nemesis, and they never explained what the fuck he's doing there. I think they just didn't care about this continuity. There's been rumors that Wesley will appear in Picard, so I wonder if he does, how they'll explain the whole Traveler thing, but I always thought it was dumb. But anyway, so this episode, it's fine, whatever. Let's move on to the next episode, which is Firstborn. Now this is, okay, so let me admit, I'll talk about some of my personal watching experience, which I had done sometimes, as far as Next Generation. So, when I was watching Next Generation, Season 6 and 7, and 5, I was watching them air for the first time, and I was taping every episode and rewatching it over and over and over again. But towards like the end of Season 7 of Next Generation and Season 2 of Deep Space Nine, I kind of dropped out a little bit. Actually, I recorded almost all of Season 3 of Deep Space Nine, but after that, I got like the first 4 or 8 episodes of Season 4 of Deep Space Nine, but after that, I kind of dropped out and stopped recording. But for some reason, I can't remember exactly why, there was 3 episodes in TNG that I didn't record. So I didn't see them enough. And that's these next 3 episodes: Firstborn, Bloodlines, and Emergence. So these were kind of always like the forbidden episodes for me. The ones that, because all the other ones, including Preemptive Strike and All Good Things, because I came back for those 2, I had on tape, so I'd watch them over and over and over and over again. But for these 3 episodes, I didn't have on tape, so I never really seen them as much. And so, like, years later, when I got it on DVD or whatever, I would, like, see them. I only saw them, like, once or twice before. And I'm like, oh, and I barely remember what happened in it. This one I do remember clearly because I did like this episode. But at first I thought it was a really great episode. Because, it has the idea of time travel. Where Alexander travels from the past to try to make himself a warrior to prevent war's death. I think that's an interesting concept, and that's basically what the whole episode is, even though you don't find this out towards the end, because the whole episode's about Kim Tar or whatever trying to turn Alexander into a warrior, but you find out at the end of the episode that Kim Tar is actually a future version of Alexander, so that's basically the episode. Problem is, I think the majority of the episode before the reveal is kind of boring. It's kind of just Klingon nonsense. Klingon, which I'm not really that on board with. But I do really like the reveal. So this episode, I would have to say, it's like a Sixth Sense type episode. In the sense that it has a really good, interesting twist ending, but without that twist ending, it's just boring. So if the episode or the movie is not good without the twist ending, then is it actually really good? I don't know. It's something for philosophers to ponder for centuries, or not. But it's weird how they had that same actor that they have over and over again play Alexander. I think that's why I didn't buy him as Alexander at first when they said that's not Alexander, because I've seen that actor before. That's the Romulan Jurok from The Defector, where he played Odo's this guy scientist Morpol or whatever who studied Odo on Deep Space Nine, where he was Jetrel on Voyager. Or that didn't happen yet. That was later, but. But still, like, I've seen this actor like constantly pops up. So I don't know. I kind of think that they should have gotten the original actor, because it's still hard for me to buy him as Alexander, because I know the guy too well. I know his face too well. It's like it's Admiral Xerox. But anyway, he's a good actor. He does do a good job in the role. But yeah. So that's it. The Sixth Sense. Anyway, so it's a decent episode. I like it. So let's move on to the next episode. Bloodlines. Now, this, unlike Firstborn, this episode it's another one that I hadn't seen only seen a couple of times. But unlike Firstborn, I was glad that I only seen it a couple of times, because it sucks. It's not good. Why do we need a sequel to the battle? Alright, let me rephrase that. We don't need a sequel to the battle. Who thought this would be a good idea to bring back Damon Bach? It's not a good idea. It's a terrible idea. Now, here's the thing about this episode, though. Most of it centers around Captain Picard, forming a bond with the son that he never knew he had. And I think that would be really interesting character development, very time well spent, important plot, setting up this son and all this. If that actually was Picard's son, when they reveal at the end of the episode that it's not Picard's son, Bach just faked it, then it invalidates the whole episode. Who cares? It's just some dude who's not related to Picard at all, and they try to play it off where he still thinks, you're of Picard as some fatherly figure or whatever, but I just don't give a shit. I think that whole reveal just is stupid, and I think it would have been way more interesting if they actually said, yes, this is Picard's son. That would be a bold move, and that's something that they would have to stick to in the future. Even the show Picard would have to stick to that, and I think that would be, they should have done that. Honestly, I think it ruins the entire episode that it's not his son, and plus having Bach and the whole thing of Bach trying to kill him, that's stupid. I'm sorry. So to this episode. That's what I say. Alright, next episode, the other episode I hadn't seen, is another one I think sucks, and that's Emergence. Now, to be fair, on my recent rewatch, when I rewatched this episode, I appreciated it a tad bit more than I had in the past. I wouldn't say this completely sucks and is one of the worst episodes ever, but it's still not good. To me, I think it's funny because I find this episode cheesy, where some people won't, and they find Mask incredibly cheesy, so I guess it's the eye of the beholder, no accounting for taste and all that. But, yeah, there's just something about this episode where the head of the holodeck characters are reacting to the ship, flying around, and they'd be like, oh, we're going to New Vertiform City. It's something about that I found so dumb. I just don't like it. And the other thing is, I don't like the concept of the Enterprise becoming alive. This is something some novels toyed with as well, and I always hated that. I think the Enterprise is a ship; it doesn't need to be alive. I think Discovery also toyed with this in one of their short treks as well, and I just don't. You don't need to make the starship alive. I just don't like that concept. Now, granted, in this episode, it wasn't necessarily that the Enterprise is alive. It's more like another life form took over the Enterprise and was using it to procreate and create this other life form. Once it was created, it kindly fucked off. But they never explained where the hell it came from or why it was doing that. And I don't know, even though that was the case, it was still, the Enterprise was still alive, essentially. And that's what the episode was about. And I just find that stupid. And they keep fighting them, and of course the Enterprise keeps fighting back, and they realize, oh, we have to go. Maybe the best way is to just let the Enterprise do what it needs to do. Yeah, why didn't you figure that out early? I don't know, the whole thing about it's looking to create this other life form, and having the holodeck being the metaforms, a new vertiform city, and having the gangster and the gunslinger. I don't know. I don't like it. I don't like it. Anyway, as I said when I watched it recently, I appreciated it a little more. I think it was well constructed, the way that the metaphors and how they matched up with what the Enterprise is doing. So I'll give it a little bit of leeway, but I still don't like it. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which I think personally, if I was going to do an underrated list, particularly of Next Generation, was probably number one most underrated episode of Next Generation. That is Preemptive Strike. I think, always loved this episode. I've always been a fan of Rosa, and I think this is such the perfect send-off to her, the powerful send-off. Maybe some people didn't care about this episode because they don't care about Rosa, or maybe they didn't like where it ended with her joining the Maquis, but I thought it was damn powerful. This episode gets me every time. It really gets me right here. I think this is one of the most emotionally powerful episodes. And I will be as bold to say it is the best Maquis episode in the Star Trek franchise. Fight me. I think it's better than the two-part Maquis, which in retrospect, I don't even think is all that great. It's okay, I guess. It's better than what else did they do in the Maquis? Oh, the Eddington stuff. Even For the Cause, I think this is better than For the Cause. And it's definitely better than that Maquis crap they did with Chakotay and Torres on Voyager. So I think this is clearly the best Maquis episode because it shows exactly what they like. It gets you to sympathize with them a bit because you follow Ro and how she sympathizes with them. She forms this bond with this dude, and he's killed by the Cardassians, and it does a good job of getting into her psyche of how she was how she was raised, and how this sort of affects her, how she sees the Cardassians, and also how she saw Picard as her mentor, and she mainly didn't give a fuck about letting Starfleet down. She just didn't want to let him down. But at the end, when Riker goes to Picard and says, look, it seemed like she didn't care about Starfleet. She thought she was doing the right thing. Her only regret was that she let you down. And let's see the look on Picard's face of utter, like, devastation. Oh, I mean, Patrick Stewart played that so well. So well. It's just such a powerful episode, particularly, like, as I said, like, it was a great look in the Maquis, and it got you to sympathize with the Maquis. And honestly, like, Picard and Riker kind of came off as the bad guys in this episode. I love this episode. I think it's criminally underrated. This should be, I've always put this in my top 10s. Like, you go back, you watch my top 10 Next Generation, and there's another one that I erased, you can't watch it anymore. But this episode's there, in my top 10. Top 10 best episodes of the entire show, and I'm sticking by that. This episode is one of the most powerful episodes of all of Star Trek. So good. Anyway, speaking of that, let's get into the finale. All good things. So, what can I say about this episode that I haven't said? I talked about this episode on a lot of videos because it is not only one of the best Next Generation episodes, one of the best Star Trek episodes of the franchise. It is one of the best, if not the best, series finales of any show ever. I put this, when I did my series finale countdown, I put this at number 2 behind Breaking Bad, mainly just because Worf and Troy, which I'll talk about in a bit. But this is like, you watch a lot of these shows, Game of Thrones, oh my god, Lost, that do such a horrible job of ending. And it's actually, and you think about it, it is really hard to end a show. And a lot of shows really struggle with this. And a lot of shows fail. Honestly, I think most shows aren't able to put out a successful final episode. And the ones that do put out like a passable, like BoJack Horseman one. That was a decent final episode, but it wasn't like a crowning achievement or anything. It wasn't like amazing. Where this is a crowning. This is like the model. It's only a model. No, it's the model of exactly what a series finale should be like, where it reconnects with its roots, it celebrates the show that came before, while telling a really engaging, intriguing, well thought out, powerful story that has themes that are the same themes that touch on the very nature of the show, the very nature of the Star Trek franchise, about exploring one's inner self. And I'll point to the poster. I have an All Good Things poster behind me. I always point to that. But the unknown something of existence. I can't remember. But anyway, yeah, it was done so well. And just to Picard going from the past to the future, and the present, back and forth, over and over again, seeing this version of the future, which of course doesn't come to pass, but I do like how Picard took aspects of that and incorporated it into the show. I really appreciated that. Even though it wasn't that exactly, because in this future Data's alive and Troy's dead, which is not what we see in Picard, but anyway, and touching back to the very first episode, kind of far point, seeing Tasha again, but not seeing O'Brien on the bridge, but not making a big deal out of it, just saying, oh, that's Tasha, and it's just, it was done so well, and the through storyline, the way Q is used in this episode is, in my opinion, the best use of Q. How he's kind of a helping hand, but he's a bit menacing at the same time. And kind of comedic. He cracks his joke about, oh, what is that, Sonny? Like, it's Q at his best, even though he's not like the main focus of this episode. But he is the driving force, though. As he admits at the end of the episode that he's the one that kind of put him in the mess in the first place, because they made him time travel That's what allowed Picard to do the 3 tachyon things at the same time, which is what created the anomaly. It's just so much good stuff about this episode. I could go on and on about how amazing this episode is, but then there's Worf and Troy. This is the worst example of Worf and Troy. They have no chemistry. I don't buy them together. It's so dumb. Please don't. So that's the only stain on this episode. But other than that, and plus it has Tomalak. It has like these cameos from all these characters that appeared earlier, but like the Admiral dude, but not in ways that are like in your face. Like, oh look, you remember this guy? No, it's just like even Tasha. The way they bring her back is kind of low key, and that's great. This is exactly how you should do final episode. I always love that ending scene with Q when he explains to Picard. It's like the charting the unknown things of existence. Like that is such a powerful scene, and it just really ties the whole show together. It's a amazing episode, and the perfect way to end the show. Anyway, so those are all the episodes of Season 7. So as I always do, it is time for me to name the best and the worst episode of the season. It was the best of episodes, it was the worst of episodes. So let's get into the worst episode first. You got some contenders for worst episode. You got Descent Part 2, Liaisons, Bloodlines, Emergence. But come on, there's no competition. Easily the worst episode of the season, possibly the show, is Sub Rosa. What a pile of garbage. And apparently, like, Michael Piller and Rick Berman didn't want this episode to be made because, like, this is gonna be stupid, but what's her face, Jerry Taylor, insisted on it, and she still says that it's only men that don't like this episode. No, it's anyone with any intelligence doesn't like this episode. It's terrible. Absolute schlock garbage. I can't believe Dr. Crusher having sex with a space ghost and the space ghost taking over her grandmother's dead body and going, leave her alone. Oh god. Got it. Okay. Best episode. There's contrary to popular opinion, there is a lot of great episodes this season. Like a lot. I was blown away at how many amazing episodes there were this season. So contenders for best episode, we got Forces of Nature, you got Thine Own Self, Genesis, Firstborn, Phantasms, the Pegasus, Homeward, Preemptive Strike, Lower Decks, Parallels. But out of all these great episodes, best episode is, of course, All Good Things. Of course. Absolutely encapsulates what Next Generation is. It's such an amazing episode. Really, really honors the show that came before while telling a very unique and well-written personal story. This is what I remember. Like, I think it was not Rick Berman. I think it was what's his name, Ronald D. Moore and Brennan Braga. I think one of them once said, or maybe both of them, that they wish that this was the first Star Trek movie, because this is better, clearly much better than any of those next gen movies. And it would have been great if the movie was more like this episode, or if this episode was the movie, because it's really epic, and I could see it being a movie, and it really, really, really captures the soul of Star Trek and Next Generation. So, yeah, best episode of the season. Anyway, so my rating for Season 7 out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. It's a 9. I'm giving this season a 9. Contrary to everyone, oh, the season's subpar, they lost their bullshit. You got all those amazing episodes that just aired. You got these episodes that get eeriness across. You got the perfect ending. You got emotional highs like freaking Homeward and Preemptive Strike. You have creepiness done well in Phantasms and Genesis, and other really unique emotional episodes like Homeward and Thine Own Self and Lower Decks. An amazing season. So, not perfect, of course. You do have a poor start and sub Rosas in this season, so so not a 10, but a 9. I'm firm on this 9. I don't care what anyone else says. It's a really good season. So, that is it for my coverage of Star Trek Next Generation. Thanks so much for watching. I am, of course, not entirely done with my Next Generation coverage, as I shall return in a month to do my top 50 best episodes of Next Generation and my top 30 worst. These videos, of course, will be like a couple hours long, and I'll rant and rave and babble on for as long as I damn well please. And it's just part of this series to celebrate finishing up Star Trek Next Generation. And I think I am going to do a third video. I haven't been doing it for the past couple of shows, but I think I will do a third video for Next Gen, but it won't be a countdown. So I'll leave you pondering of what that might be. But anyway, so that's all coming out next month. So usually when I finish a show, I announce the next show that I'll be reviewing month to month, and starting in 2 months. And it's not going to be a Star Trek show. I'm sure everyone was probably expecting me to do the original series, because that's the only Star Trek show I haven't done this format for yet. But I'm sorry, I don't feel like it. I'm putting the original series off a bit. I'm sorry, I'm not a huge original series guy, and I just don't like binge watching that show from the 60s. It's really outdated. I'll do it eventually, I promise, but not now. Instead, what I'm going to do, and again, probably no one's going to watch it because y'all just want to see Star Trek. But the one show or 2 shows, I shall say, that I really want to go back and rewatch and review is Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. So I will be covering the Breaking Badiverse, going through season by season of Breaking Bad, which I hadn't really done. I only did 1 video for Breaking Bad before. We're in the top 10, so 2 videos. One was a review, one was the top 10, but this time I wanted to do this format when I go episode by episode, really get into the nooks and crannies, talk about why that episode, The Fly, absolutely sucks, and everyone who thinks otherwise is wrong, and covering other episodes of Breaking Bad, of course, as well. So yeah, and Better Call Saul I actually already did, because as soon as that aired, I was covering it week to week, so I'm kind of gonna do it again, but in this format. But that would be like sort of rewatch. And the point is to sort of do this building up before Better Call Saul season 6 comes out. And you might be thinking, well, that's not coming out forever. But you got to realize is that it's going to, because I'm not starting this for another 2 months, and I want to do 1 season a month, so it's going to take me over a year to do this, so I might not actually be done by the time season 6 Better Call Saul comes out. Hopefully, maybe with the COVID thing I will be, but we'll see. Anyway, so that's what I'm going to do. So, I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait a couple of years for the original series. It's not really in my interest right now, I'm sorry. But you can check out my channel as I do many more reviews. I do some original series episode reviews and some episodes reviews of other Star Trek shows. As I said, in the month I shall return with my top 30 worst Next Generation episodes and my top 50 best. And I do many other videos on other shows like The Expanse, Lower Decks, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.